some of the camp followers were officers' wives. And these are the women people have often heard about. That is, we know that Martha Washington joined her husband every winter wherever the army was encamped. Martha didn't want to go. She was a homebody and she wanted to stay at home in Virginia, but she felt it was her obligation to her husband and to the army, and so she went every winter. Now, when the generals' wives, like Martha Washington or Katie Green or Henry Knox's wife, Lucy Knox, went to the encampments, they did not sleep in tents. Their husbands commandeered homes for them nearby and sent enlisted men to work as domestic servants for these women, so that the household was filled with soldiers who were cooking and or cleaning or serving the food at the dinner table, because the job of these women, in a sense, I use job in quotes, was to entertain the officer corps, to keep their morale up. And so there were often dinner parties, there were dances or balls, as they called them, given. And it's quite comic to see the invitations to the balls, only to officers. Enlisted men were not invited. But the invitation said, you must have respectable breeches on, respectable pants that don't have holes in them anywhere. Because the officers, like the men, often were in clothes that were shop worn, that is, were old and had seen several years in the army. And so there were rules about what you weren't allowed to come if you were going to show skin under your pants. These women came not because they were fearful or desperate or lacked food or firewood. They came in part because they thought it was their duty, and they came because they really believed it was important to show that the officers' wives, as well as the enlisted men's wives, were willing to make the sacrifice to come to the army camp. And so in that sense, it was a patriotic gesture on their part. But some of them reveal in their letters that they came because they were lonely. Lucy Knox, Henry Knox's wife, is a great example of this. She was an only child, and her parents, the Fluckers, were loyalists, and they had left America and gone to England. And she would write to Henry Knox, who she called Harry, "My dear Harry, I am so alone. I come home to an empty house at night, and I miss you so much, and I have no one to talk to." And so she raced as soon as the army sat itself down. Lucy Knox was in the army camp, and there she socialized with other women of her social class, and she saw her husband, and she loved it so much that it was very hard for Henry Knox to get her to leave. And you would see an exchange of notes where he would say, "We're about to go to battle, dear. You've got to go home." And she would say, "Oh, just one more day, just one more week. I don't want to go home. I love it here." The other wife that I enjoyed always was Katie Green, Catherine Green. Catherine Green was Nathaniel Green's wife, and Nathaniel Green was a Quaker who decided it was important, despite his religious faith, to defend his country's liberty. He was not a wealthy man. Katie Green was much younger than him. She was really close to being a teenager, and he adored her, and he indulged her tremendously. And Katie Green, if you live in New York, we have a department store called Bloomingdale's where all the young, fashionable women used to shop. And I always refer to Katie Green as the first Bloomingdale's lady, because before she came to camp, she would insist on going to Providence and buying a whole new wardrobe. And this was very expensive for Nathaniel Green. And he would write her a letter saying, "Well, Katie, maybe you could wear some of the dresses that you brought to camp last year. And she would write back, I couldn't possibly be seen in the same clothes I had on last year. I have to go buy a completely new wardrobe. And you can just see Nathaniel Green sighing and going, okay, dear, go ahead. She was a very charming, very pretty, a little, at the time, sort of giddy, and a great dancer. And Martha Washington didn't like to dance. Washington loved to dance. He was a very fine dancer. And in the 18th century, it was men's well-turned ankles and calves, not women's, that were a sign of attractiveness, because men wore shorter pants and stockings. And Washington liked to show off his well-turned ankle and calf. And he loved to dance, because that was one place where you could really show it off. And so he would dance at these balls all night with Katie Green and have a wonder. There was nothing else going on. This is not a gossip show. But he really enjoyed her company. He was very fond of her. When Nathaniel Green, who became the hero of the war in the South at the end of the war, when he died, the South Carolinians had given him a plantation to honor him for what he had done. And Katie Green went to live on this plantation. And it was there that, the man who claimed credit for inventing the cotton gin went to visit. And actually, it was Katie Green who had come up, by then Catherine Green, who had come up with the design for the cotton gin. If you're African American, this is one of the low points in American history, because of course it continued slavery. But if you're interested in inventions, one should credit Catherine Green with inventing the cotton gin. So these women came for patriotic reasons, whereas the ordinary camp follower came out of necessity. What they shared in common was they often were extremely lonely when their husbands or fathers or brothers were away.